When I first did my initial review of the changes coming in the Season 8 PTR and the new unique, as well as the new minion aspect, I was pretty sour on the totality of it all. I actually think that this weapon will literally never see any use ever. But you can't really judge a book by its cover. You gotta go in, you gotta test it. So let's watch me run this tier 68 pit that I struggle bust through. This build can maybe get up to tier 69, nice. And just take a quick little snapshot of the gear I'm currently wearing and the fact that I have level 100 glyphs, and let's have a very honest conversation about Sanguivore, the Blade of Zir. For a little bit of context, you need to understand where ultimate skills are currently at in Season 7 and where they're going to be in Season 8. There were basically two massive changes. One to the Zan rune. Zan would say that the next skill that you cast would overpower and crit, and since you could basically trigger this every time that you wanted to cast Army of the Dead, you can make it so that Army of the Dead would overpower and crit on every single skeleton over its entire duration. Now they've changed it so that Zan basically creates this little window of a quarter of a second. After you trigger it, any damage you would do would overpower and crit during that 0.25 seconds. And funnily enough, this is still by far the best rune word to use on the build, because with enough overlapping damage instances and enough lucky hit chance from a double masterwork crit, greater affixed Fists of Fate, you can trigger it quite often. And that means that you can basically expect to be overpowering on some amount of the damage of this skill fairly often. Not over the entirety of its duration, absolutely not, but somewhere in the ballpark of like good enough to use. And then we have to think about the actual scaling of this skill itself. I myself had never really pushed on Army of the Dead, but it was doing tier 130 in Season 7. And that's with all the witch power skills and the occult gems and all of that, of course, making ultimate skills very strong. The damage multiplier that you had on Army of the Dead in Season 7 was a 120 times damage multiplier. Grandfather, which grants you 100% critical strike damage bonus, is a 2 times multiplier. Army of the Dead had a 120 times damage multiplier. That's a whole lot of damage multiplication. But in the PTR, they have restricted the damage bonus on Army of the Dead down to 200% total damage bonus, meaning a 3 times multi. So going from a 120 times multi down to a 3 times multi, as well as a skill which will overpower on every single damage instance versus a skill which will overpower for a quarter of a second every few seconds. And you can see how this skill kind of really went down the drain very quickly. The developers, in their infinite wisdom, gave us Sanguivore, a sword that says a lot of things. But what you basically need to know about Sanguivore is just putting on the sword and just putting on one other item with ranks to mastery on it will already completely fill up the 200% damage bonus. That's pretty convenient. And while it then says things like plus ranks to skeleton and warrior mage mastery, the actual effect of it only increases the skill Army of the Dead's damage. So while this was initially sold to us as some kind of hybrid minion Army of the Dead sword, you would never run a minion build with a weapon that does not increase your minion's damage, not in a meaningful way. Now, I have seen some arguments be made that if you were to get greater affix on the mastery and then triple masterwork crit it, you would gain 12 ranks to all of your minions. And that's a lot of damage, except it's less than a 2 times damage multiplier when taken into account the fact that you already had damage multiplication from these masteries before. So it's basically a sword that says worse than grandfather, and that's it. So again, you will never use this on a minion build. It's not good for minion leveling. It's not a minion sword. It is strictly an Army of the Dead sword. And when you look at the aspect, again, the most words on a unique item, but what it basically comes down to is your summons will apply Vampiric Curse. The only thing that Vampiric Curse does is that if a target would die, you gain a soul. You get 20 of these souls, and then however many souls you have in total will increase Army of the Dead's damage. Now, I'll also increase the damage of the souls, but just to give you an idea, the souls themselves only do 100% of your weapon-based damage for scaling, and as a reference point, Army of the Dead per skeleton does 576 damage scaling. So these souls are not adding on any meaningful damage. You can't really scale them. They're not minions. And again, this sword is the only thing that directly scales it on the build. They literally do nothing. Ignore them. But the way that you get this damage multiplication is already the first issue with the sword. If you're watching this gameplay quite closely, you'll notice that I'm doing one thing and one thing only, and that's casting Raise Skeleton. Because to actually get Vampiric Souls, you would have to kill monsters. But considering in the pit, you do not kill monsters until the very end, you cannot get souls, meaning you can't get damage multiplication for Army of the Dead. But if you consume a corpse while equipping this sword, you will get a soul. So you'll notice I'm clicking Raise Skeleton basically 20 times in between each cast. And in fact, it's taking me so long to do it that I don't even have Army of the Dead up all of the time because I haven't eaten enough souls yet. If you don't eat the souls, you get no damage multiplication from this weapon. So you have to click Raise Skeleton 20 times in between packs and in between each cast of it to get anything out of it. That's numero dos. 1, the sword's crap, but 2, this gameplay loop is my least favorite experience playing the Necromancer. And I've done the wild stuff like the full snapshot Soul Rift build that had to trigger multiple things by consuming potions and untimely death, and then get the Caxrin procced, then you cast Soul Rift, then you cast Bone Spirit, and then Bone Spirit would trigger Soul Rift. That build was by far our clunkiest build until this sword came out. But we did do it. I cleared a tier 68. I probably could do a tier 69. I just didn't have the patience to keep pushing for it. And again, this is without boss powers, but it is with triple masterworked gear across the board, extremely high rolled stats, and just like stuff that no one should really have to go out and get to be able to run a build that's only doing tier 68. Because you have to remember, the scaling in the pit got really strong. So I just wanted to show you the math real quick of what it would take to run a pit tier 100 in comparison to a tier 68. Tier 68 is what we just did. We want to get up to tier 100. You have to understand that it is 18% scaling per pit tier. You need to be able to do 18% more damage to clear the same tier pit at the same speed that you currently are. So that's 1.18 total multiplier of the damage that we would need. And since there are 32 tiers in between 68 and 32, you would have to take this to the power of 32, meaning I would have to do, this is very ridiculous, I would have to be doing nearly 200 times the amount of damage that I'm doing right now to be able to clear a pit tier 100. And this is with level 100 glyphs. I've saved 32 points here, so I guess this would technically be a Paragon 268 character, level 268. I'm using my mercenaries. I guess I didn't drink elixirs, and I'm not using boss powers. With these things on, though, I might be able to do a tier 70, maybe a tier 71. Doesn't have any other scalers in our skill tree that actually matter other than Hellbent Commander, because oddly enough, in our skill tree, there aren't scalers for just summoning damage. Masteries don't differently empower the build after the initial 200%. Even Kalan's Edict doesn't make it do more damage, because Kalan's Edict increases minion damage, whereas something like Hellbent Commander increases summon damage, and this is a summoning skill. We just don't really have summoning skill scalers. The Dead Razor glyph works in general because that's just a generic damage multiplier, but if you were to look at something like Cult Leader increases minion damage based off attack speed, not summoning damage. The only reason why any of this really matters is because Unyielding Commander luckily increases summoning damage, so this on an amulet is a pretty big damage multi. This is a 2.65 multi just from putting this onto our amulet. It's not good for speed farming in the open world because you're not going to be able to reset the cooldown fast enough, because the way that you do that is by Decrepify procs and overlapping a ton of damage instances all in one small area. If you've ever taken a really strong pit build and like gone into the Helltide, you might even die sometimes because you don't have Soul Rift uptime or whatever, and it's just because builds that are good at doing the pit do not translate to the rest of the game in a meaningful way. A little bit for Infernal Hordes, but even then, not really. And that's the other part about it too. Since we're using Army of the Dead and no Soul Rift, even though I have 17,000 maximum life on this build, there's not a great way of gaining a ton of survivability. We can generate barrier, but it's only from lucky hit chance. Now, luckily your minions can trigger this too, but only having a 20% chance to be able to generate barrier might save your life a couple times. But there was a really interesting thing that I ran into that continued to cause problems, and that's the fact that Bloodmist eats your souls. Now, the fine print of how Vampiric Curse works is that you store up all of these souls, and then if you were to cast a defensive, macabre, or agility skill, it will release them. On top of that, the sword itself says that when you cast Army of the Dead, that also unleashes the souls. So that's kind of cool, right? The problem is, though, your only survivability tool is Bloodmist, and Bloodmist is a macabre skill. So if you have to Bloodmist away from a pack of monsters that are about to kill you, and you got all the way up to 20 souls by raising Skeleton, you now have to eat 20 more corpses with raised Skeleton before you cast Army of the Dead, or it's missing out on a 3 times damage multiplier. Now, you're still going to have to spam it every once in a while because you can't afford not to, but it creates this inorganic downtime where if you had to survive something with your only tool that lets you do that, you basically have to start over from square one. And I can't stress enough just like how slow you consume these souls. I have additional attack speed on right now. And do. At that point, I would have eaten enough to be able to then cast Army of the Dead. Now, luckily, Army of the Dead will create corpses, but just sitting here and having to individually eat corpses all the way up to 20 before you can realistically cast the skill again, or it wasn't worth using the sword in the first place, is a huge drag. Not only that, once you have all of your buffs up, sometimes this is just hidden. You just can't see this buff because there's too many on the screen. And I'm not even drinking, using incense or drinking elixirs at this point. And there was often I just couldn't see it, so I just kind of had to guess by feel. But all in all, I think that Sanguivore is going to be an item that is going to compel new players, similar to things like Bloodless Scream or Mortarcrux, to try to find a way to make it work. And it is technically the best sword for an Army of the Dead build. Sadly, they killed Army of the Dead. It's just not worth your time to play. The amount of setup just to be able to cast the skill one time and struggle your way through a tier 68 is not really going to entice so many people to be able to play it. It's very squishy. It doesn't have a lot of survivability because you only have one row of skeletons. You can't generate barrier. It's just generally a very clunky build. It's not particularly fun to play. And again, look at the gear investment I have on right now. This is insane. If you can't clear a tier 70 pit, you're not going to have gear like this. But what could they do to change this sword? Well, the fact that it has ranks to mastery on it in the first place, again, paints the picture that this is meant to be a minion weapon. The fact that it only increases just Army of the Dead skill damage and not your minions damage per soul that you have stored just doesn't really make sense. Now, if instead vampiric souls that were stored granted your minions attack speed and damage, or perhaps while you had stores sold, made them do blood skill damage or bone skill damage, or added the darkness tag or something like that, something that actually transformed your minions themselves to enable building into them in a meaningful way, that would be pretty cool. And it seems like it's right there, right? It's Sanguivore, the Blade of Zir. Now again, the Vampiric Curse is how we're playing into Zir, but if there was any opportunity for them to finally add a skill tag like Blood to our minions, maybe something that would then help them overpower, this is where it could be. As long as you have Vampiric Soul stored, your skeletons and your golem are considered to have the blood tag. They have a 25% chance to overpower. Something like that would take this thing from completely useless to very interesting very quickly. If it could also add on the blood skill tag to Army of the Dead, and now you actually have ways of scaling it in a meaningful way, I think we're in business. Let's really play into the fact that this is literally Blood Drinker's sword, the sword of the vampire. And let's just make that happen. But I do think that this really goes a long way to highlight something I brought up in my feedback video from checking out the patch notes of the PTR. Soul Rift as a damage skill is completely dead. Bone Storm as a damage skill is completely dead. Army of the Dead as a damage skill is completely dead. The only ultimate that we have that does legitimate damage that will actually scale in any meaningful way is Blood Wave. And it's because its base damage is insane. It has incredibly powerful uniques as well as aspects. And on top of that, it's a blood skill. Blood skills just have the strongest scalers and the ability to overpower on demand. Nothing else is going to come even close. But reducing the damage multiplier on both Army of the Dead and Bone Storm down to only a 3 times damage multi, along with the nerf that came to Blood Wave, is just a poor decision. These skills are in no way, shape, or form made equal to Blood Wave, especially poor Soul Rift. I really like the change that Soul Rift will actually generate potions for you, because that played into how we were playing the Soul Rift build. We would drink potions to be able to trigger our rune words, to be able to snapshot. But now they took the ability to snapshot out of it. Soul Rift with the Unmaker helmet will literally never be a build recommended anywhere, and we might get rid of the build guide on max roll. That's how bad of an experience it is. These skills need to be individually tuned, outside of the concept of all ultimates are made equal when they just are not, and have different avenues and opportunities to be able to scale their damage in meaningful ways. I don't think they just need to jack up these numbers, but that would be a decent place to start. All in all, Army of the Dead, do I think you should play it? No. Do I think this sword should be used on any builds? No. Do I think it might just end up on the heap with Mortarcrux and even at this point Black River for just a pile of unique items? Oh, and obviously rest in peace to Bloodless Scream. But is this just going to add up to a pile of unique weapons that the Necromancer never really gets to use because for whatever reason we just can't quite hit the mark with them? Probably. There's this weird kind of continuous reality where the unique weapons that we get are so hyper-specific and so minimal in the power that they grant for how specific they are that the Necromancer just ends up not really getting to use any of them. We can use the Grandfather and Doombringer, but everything else is pretty much trash, and it's pretty sad to see. I would love for all of them to get some attention, but at least I really wanted to shine a light on this one since it's the new toy that ostensibly is what we're supposed to be excited about walking into this season. Now, if you're brand new here and you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. I don't want you to miss out on any of this insight as we get closer to Season 8. Obviously, we're going to be updating build guides once the new patch notes from the PTR learnings come out, so look forward to that as well. I stream every day, Twitch and YouTube, 1 to 7 p.m. ET. If you haven't known that already, you can come hang out with me. But subscribe to the channel if you're new. Leave a like on this video. Leave a comment down below if you have any thoughts, ideas, differences of opinion. Have you come up with a different way of using the sword? Have you gotten better results out of it? I'd love to hear from you. Thank you very, very much for watching this video. I truly hope that it helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.